Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm very glad to present Professor Anwar SHAIKH from New School University of USA. And Professor SHAIKH is going to present the real economic analysis and alternative framework for economics. The floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Kara. I want to thank the International Symposium on Economic Thought for this invitation. I'm honored to be included in such a set of distinguished economists, which when I looked on your list is pretty distinguished. I can make the outline of my talk and the PowerPoint charts available to you. I'll put them on my book webpage, but you can also put a link to it. So what do I want to talk about? I want to talk about the logical structure of my book. The book is, I'm having trouble going down. Hang on a second. My book is about the history of economic thought in the sense that it attempts to offer a coherent alternative to neoclassical and post-Keynesian economics. And the roots of the arguments that I'm presenting appear in the works of Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Keynes, and Harrod. But it is not a matter of taking bits and pieces and sticking them together, because the idea is to present a coherent alternative, a systematic alternative to existing economic frameworks. And I'm going to come back to that. I spend a lot of time in my book about how to compare the argument I'm making, which is kind of general theory, what I call real economic analysis, and compared to neoclassical theory, which is the dominant form, but also to Keynesian and post-Keynesian theory. I will do a little bit of that at the end when I talk about the implications of my argument for macro dynamics and for policy. But for now, I just want to make the other point. Fully half of my book is empirical, because no general theory can claim it's a general theory unless it is related to the empirical evidence. So this is not a general theory in the sense of neoclassical economics. It's not about perfection and the implications of perfection. It is about understanding how capitalism operates, first of all, in the center, though I can come back to how it operates in international trade and so on, so that we can see its properties, its structural patterns, and its movement over time. So all the data that I use in my book is documented and available in spreadsheets on my book webpage, which is called realecon.org. And many of the things I'm doing now will appear on that webpage also. Let me start by reminding you what the book is not about. Neoclassical theory, as you know, rests on the theory of perfect competition. And post-Keynesian theory rests on the theory of imperfect competition. Now, I've always argued that perfect competition and imperfect competition are duals. After all, you cannot have something imperfect unless you refer to something perfect. So they're tied to each other. And I want to break that tie. I want to make the point that there already was a very powerful understanding of capitalism, which had to do with real competition and the turbulent processes that go with it. And this is as different from perfect competition as war is from a ballet. In perfect competition, it is a ballet. The theory of perfect competition then allows me to explain Kalecki's findings on inter-industry prices and profit margins. And that shows that these findings are absolutely consistent and derivable from real competition. And therefore, there's no reason to take these findings and make it into a theory of imperfect competition. If you read Kalecki's book, originally he starts off by trying to study the theory of perfect competition, what he calls atomistic competition, and then he goes to empirical evidence and doesn't fit. So therefore he says, well, this must be due to monopoly. But it isn't. It's not due to oligopoly. It is due to the logical consequences of how real competition operates. Now, one implication of the argument I'm making is that the theory of real competition, I will argue and I'll try and show you, provides a natural foundation for Keynes's theory of effective demand. And it's interesting to note that Keynes famously insisted that his theory of effective demand was founded in competition, not in imperfect competition, but in what he called atomistic competition. And I'm going to show you that his theory of effective demand follows naturally from the classical foundation of real competition. So that leads us to the question, what is real competition? Well, in the first place, real competition means firms set prices and seek to displace their competitors by offering lower prices. These are competitive behaviors. And as Marx insists, as Smith insists, as Ricardo insists, and in fact, as any study of business practices will confirm. I discuss business literature and business evidence and business arguments in my book because in this domain, they understand competition much better than the economists. Now, in real competition, the survival advantage in price cutting goes to firms with lower costs. Hence, there must be a relentless drive on the part of firms to cut costs, to lower wages, or to fight for lower wages and to develop new lower cost technologies. And part of the fight for lower wages is to move to areas where wages are lower or costs are lower because of mineral rights or costs are lower because unions are not permitted or whatever. And this is the natural interest of each individual capitalist. It doesn't come from a plot made by monopoly capitalists or by the US. It is the history of capitalism from the beginning. If this is true, then we have a way to understand the historical struggles between capital and labor over the length of the day. You know, as you may or may not know, the working day was originally 16 hours, 6 days a week, and was over time through bitter political and social struggle was reduced gradually so that children didn't have to work, so people could take a little time off. And this historical struggle took over 100 years. So what in the West, in the advanced countries, we call a normal working day, was nothing normal about it. It was achieved through struggle. Today in China, the big capitalists of China say that the idea of proper working day is what is called 996. And that is from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That's 12 hours a day, 6 days, 72 hours a week. And that is considered to be the appropriate and desirable length of the working day. So when you look at the struggle between capital and labor, and you look at the struggle between capital and capital, you look at the struggle to improve technical change and to find new materials, you see a social historical path of real wages, labor productivity, and the capital intensity of production. Marx argues, for instance, that to lower costs, obviously firms can fight back against labor and lower wages, but there's a limit, he says, to that because labor can also fight back. So one of the intrinsic ways to lower costs is to increase productivity through technical change. And Marx argues, and actually others, Smith and Ricardo, tend to agree, that technical change requires increased capital intensity and larger scale in order to be more competitive. So large scale and capital intensity rising are not products, are not phenomena of imperfect competition. They're actually a logical and necessary consequence of real competition. At the microeconomic level, firms invest only if their expected rate of return on investment exceeds a safe rate of return. And what is that safe rate of return? That is the interest rate. I mean, why should a firm make an investment if it expects that the investment will be producing a rate of return lower than what it could get in the bank? This is the argument made by the classical tradition. So what the key issue for investment at the micro level is that the net rate of return, the expected rate of return minus the rate of return on investment, minus the interest rate, is positive. The same net rate of return motivates flows of capital across industries. If you're in one industry and the net profit rate is high, and you're in another industry it's low, then you will move, capital will move more into the higher industry and increases supply and bring prices down, more slowly into the lower industry, raise prices and bring the profit rate up until there is rough correspondence. Now, rough correspondence does not mean equality. It means a very turbulent correspondence, and I'm going to show you the data. So the net profit rate motivates investment in each sector, and it also motivates investment across sectors. And this is a point of turbulent adjustment, not equality. There's never any moment where these are equal. One goes above and capital moves in and it pushes it down. Another goes below and capital moves in more slowly, pushes it up. And they're always cycling. And of course, there are shocks and more concrete factors. So you will never see the equality. But you can see it if you look at the path of crossing back and forth. Now, I'm going to come to this in a minute. If this is true, and this is the foundation of the theory of relative prices in Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and certainly Harrod, which is the idea that prices will be regulated by this process of equalization of profit rates. And these will produce a particular kind of price, which Smith and Ricardo call natural prices, and which Marx calls prices of production. They reflect equal profit rates, not in the sense that you'll ever have them, but in the sense that the inequality provokes kinds of movements. Now, I do a lot of the empirical and theoretical discussion of it in my book. Cost curves, money, profits, bond prices, interest rates, stock prices, and the rate of return and international trade. At this point, at all points, I compare the theory I'm presenting with Keynesian and post-Keynesian theories and also with neoclassical theories, because you obviously have to know them all if you're going to be able to talk about economics as in a general way. So now, so far I've focused on the idea that real competition is motivated by the net rate of return, expected net rate of return. So if you're a business and you expect a rate of return of 20% and the interest rate is 3%, then you have a very strong incentive to expand. As you expand, you buy more raw materials, you hire more labor, you give out more incomes to your owners and creditors, and these pump up aggregate demand. So you have other people joining in, and you get the typical wave of upturn, which Keynes focuses on, which he talks about the booms of animal spirits due to animal spirits because they feed off each other. On the contrary, if your rate of return expected is less than the interest rate or coming close to the interest rate, more and more capitalists will find it's not worth it because it's very risky to make a long-term investment, 15, 20 years. So the whole idea of their expectations, of their waves of optimism and pessimism is grounded in this idea that they're making judgments on the future, which is highly uncertain, and these judgments can lead to animal spirits going up and animal spirits going down. It should be noted that, as I said, Keynes refused any notion that his theory should be grounded in imperfect competition, which was, after all, his followers, Chamberlain and John Robinson. He said, no, my theory is based on competition. And it's very interesting to know, Kalecki is very famous for the idea of monopoly, but in fact, Kalecki's original formulation of his own theory of effective demand was based on the notion of free competition. So there is no necessary link between the theory of aggregate demand and the idea of monopoly. On the contrary, the idea of aggregate demand, as I'm going to show you in the Keynesian framework, is a natural consequence of real competition. So in that sense, one of the things my book tries to do is to return the theory of effective demand to its proper ground. Now, this has further implications. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply both rest on profitability. If you think about it, that's very clear. Firms engage in production, which is supply, on their basis of their near-term expected profitability of operation. If you don't think your business is going to last a year, you're certainly not going to keep hiring people or even maintain people. You start cutting back you cut back the raw materials demand, you cut back what you pay to your creditors, so you shrink. And if you shrink, then the money that would have gone into wages shrinks, and the demand from labor for consumer goods shrinks. The money that would have gone to your creditors or gone to your owners as rents, profits, dividends, and interest, that shrinks, and their demand for consumption goods shrinks. And of course, if you're shrinking, your demand for investment is going to shrink, so investment also shrinks. So you can see that the current operations of businesses, the source or the foundation of consumer demand, and the long-term expectations of firms are the source of investment demand. Therefore, C plus I, consumption and investment, are both rooted, consumption demand, investment demand, are both rooted in profitability. One in short-term profitability, the other in long-term profitability. It follows, and of course, there is no such thing as aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is a sum of aggregated supply and demand. Aggregate supply and demand is aggregated supply and demand. So all these processes I'm talking about are from micro foundations, different firms. Not that they are, in the neoclassical sense, representative firms, or they have rational expectations, or any of the claims of orthodoxy, but they come from decisions made by individual firms and individual consumers, and therefore, when you talk at the aggregate level, you're never talking about aggregate demand and supply. You're talking about aggregated demand and supply. And that means that the match between aggregated demand and aggregated supply is always contingent. One is above the other, then they move, and the other is above. So you always get turbulent movement. It follows from what I'm saying that real macroeconomics is not supply side nor demand side, it is profit side. Because profit provides, near-term profit provides the basis for consumption goods, material goods, raw materials, and labor. Labor provides the basis for consumption. It provides the basis for rents and interest and dividends. They provide another basis for consumption from rentiers. And then it provides the long-term profitability, which is the investment demand. So demand and supply are regulated by profitability, but in different ways. And therefore, I reject any notion that there are two kinds of macroeconomics, supply side or demand side. In fact, both are profit side. And the attempt to separate these two is a kind of way orthodox post-Keynesian economists claim to distinguish themselves from neoclassical, but I'm arguing that both are wrong, or both are partial, because both types, demand and supply, are profit related. Now, it should be obvious, and I'm going to try to illustrate it, that what I'm saying, I'm making no reliance on rational choice and optimal outcome. Nothing in my book requires that. You don't need perfect behaviors, optimal outcomes, rational expectations, and therefore, what you see is not a result of the absence of these. It's not a result of imperfections. As I said before, if you're basing yourself on imperfections, you're basically part of the church, because you're saying that it is not what the church says, which is perfection. We need to get rid of that duality by rejecting it and saying, look, there's real processes, let's look at those, and we don't need perfection and imperfection. Now, in doing this, you need to talk about how different entities relate to each other. Firms, for instance, obviously firms, obviously consumers, consumers have to make a decision about pricing, about the goods that they're going to buy and the prices at which they're going to buy these goods. And they don't do it by sitting someplace and making rational calculations and torturing their utility function. They go by moving towards firms that have lower prices. And this, a proper term for this is drift. They don't all jump. Some go, some don't, some hesitate, some never go to where prices are cheaper. And this is called drift in the direction of sellers that offer lower prices. Workers will tend to drift in the direction of higher wages. Not everybody jumps and leaves their job and runs to higher wage, but the possibility of higher wages will get some to do it on the edge and others more, depending on its success. And for the same reason, employers will drift in the direction of less expensive workers or higher profit opportunities. In such cases, the individual reactions of all of these heterogeneous consumers, workers, and firms will vary according to more concrete factors. If we zoom in and look at the individual people and firms, we'll see their factors operating. If we zoom back out, we'll see that this is a movement of drift with what looks like random factors. And this means that some don't make it, some wander off, some go in a different direction even than the drift. And this is known as diffusion. It means that not only do they drift in one direction, but they spread out. And this brings up an important point for me. The theory that I'm talking about requires mathematics. It's not the opposite of mathematics. It needs history, sociology, politics, and mathematics, and of course, empirical evidence. But the mathematics we use must be appropriate to the theory in question. It's not a matter of learning how to general equilibrium or fixed point theorems or anything of that sort. You need the math for the theory. And this theory implies a math which can be expressed in terms of drift and diffusion. And that is one of the oldest mathematical tools in modern physics. These are called Fokker-Planck equations. And they deal with the fact that a particular variable can drift towards the mean in a complicated way, but as the individual entities in that can be tens, thousands of individual workers or consumers subject to concrete factors, then you don't get equality, you get a stable distribution of outcomes, stable distribution of wages, stable distribution of prices, and this follows simply from the idea that drift and diffusion interact. So I can come back to this at the end, but the main point I want to work is that it is not a case of abandoning mathematics, but of using the mathematics relevant to the theory. I don't know how many people know that Marx wrote a book on mathematics. And he did that because he was interested in trying to study mathematics, it was calculus, and because he also hoped at some point to use it to understand business cycles, which he had, of course, studied in detail. Now, when we come to consumer theory, we find that consumers make personal choices based on socially shaped habits and income and wealth levels. I mean, this is trivially obvious. Consider yourself. And if you're not so reflective as to consider yourself, consider people around you, your family, your friends, your culture. Class, race, gender, ethnicity, family, and personal histories all play their roles in determining what you eat and don't eat, what you dress and don't dress, where you go for entertainment and don't go. Markets adapt to these consumer preferences, but markets also create the preferences in multiple ways. No child is born wanting an iPhone, but after a little while, everybody wants an iPhone because it comes from the preference structure imposed or pushed by businesses. Now, I've not made any reference to rational choice and any of the other things that go with it, utility maximizing. But the argument I'm making, it's possible to construct a theory of consumer behavior in which you can derive downward sloping demand curves, price and income elasticities of necessary goods and luxury goods, which is one of the best known empirical laws in economics. It's called Engels' law. And it's not Marx's Engels, it's another Engels. And I can derive even the Keynesian consumption function. In this case, the mathematics that you need are the mathematics of stochastic entities, stochastic aggregates, and emergent properties. Again, math comes back in the story, but it's the math appropriate to the theory itself. Now, once you say this, then you have to understand that cultural and social pressures faced by consumers, which are real, are very different from the pressures faced by competitive firms. Because in comparative firms, you have the pressure, the threat of being extinct. In most times in history, you do not get killed for wearing the wrong colored clothing. By the way, that does happen among gangs in New York and other places, Chicago.
Sir, I'm very sorry for interrupting, but you have more or less 5 minutes
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, for the whole
Yes.
talk, not the empirical evidence or everything?
No, I think you have to finish, and then we may have some maybe questions.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So let
Thank
me
you.
then jump to at least one point, which is macro. I was going to do uneven. I didn't realize this. My apologies. I thought I had an hour, but I will now jump to. I have to share the screen again. Okay. Can you see this one? Classical approach. Hello, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So this is my book. And this is it in Turkish. And this is it in Chinese. Just came out. It's coming out. And when I talk, no, I was going to skip that. So let me go to one more point. One of the things about the classical argument is the idea that investment is determined by incremental rates of return. But incremental rates of return are equalized. And they're equalized because capital flows to where the rate of return is higher and flows away from where it's lower. And these are the incremental rates of return in the United States manufacturing from 1960 to 1989. Two things to know: how turbulent they are and how they cross back and forth. This is the classical, the idea of turbulent equalization. There's no equilibrium. It's a fiction. But there is a movement, and that movement is exactly this kind of thing. I'm going to skip some things and see. Okay, so let me come to the key point here. A stimulus can pump up the economy and it can lower unemployment. You can show that. I was going to show you that in the data, but I'll skip it. But a tighter labor market raises real wages. And if real wages rise faster than productivity, the wage share will rise. And if the wage share rises, the profit share falls, and the profit rate falls. And if the profit rate falls, the normal growth rate will fall unless it is offset by lower interest rates or higher productivity growth or the import of labor from one country to another, something that Turkey knows well. Now, one question that arises is, why do stimulus policies in an earlier period of time have such great effectivity? In Germany in the 1930s, United States in the 1930s, and World War II, 1940s, and they didn't work in the 1947 to 1980, which is called the Great Stagflation. And the reason is that in the earlier period, they cut the link between stimulus and the rise of prices, rise of interest rates, and the rise of the wage share. Because they refused to allow it. In the 1960s and 70s, these links were still there. And when you pumped up the economy, wages began to rise, prices began to rise, unemployment came back because the profit rate began to fall. And this is called the period of the Great Stagflation. It's a mystery to both Keynesian economics and neoclassical economics, though they came up with an answer. But it's a natural explanation from the point of view of the classical theory of real economic analysis. So let me stop there. Okay, I stopped. Yeah.
Thank you very much, dear
How are you?
Omar. Dear Professor Kara, the word is you.
Hang on.
Thank you very much. Professor Shaikh, thank you very much for your presentation. The session for you is over for now, and then we're going to proceed with the next presenter. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to log off.
If you want, sign out. If you want, you can stay and listen to Lawa.
I will catch that on YouTube,
Okay, thank
like
you.
everybody else. Hi, Mark. Good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Hello, everybody again. Well, we're going to proceed with our next guest, who's Professor Marc Lowy, from University of Ottawa and University of Sorbonne, Paris North. And Professor Laway's presentation is Godley versus Tobin on monetary matters. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, going to try to get this bigger. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Right. So, yeah, this is the topic, Godley versus Tobin on monetary matters. So this is my outline. On the right-hand side, you can see a book of my selected essays, which just got published, approximately 20